How are you doing today, Jeremy?
Doing good. Looking forward to this. I actually pre-gamed this a couple nights ago and just watched it and took some notes. And somebody in the comments is saying this is a Hitch slap, and that's certainly the case. I think if you haven't seen this before, you're going to be very entertained. There's a lot of mic drops, so I'm looking forward to deep diving with you guys.
Yeah. Oh, somebody in the chat asks, when will Amber Frost drop? So that's the episode that's coming out tomorrow is the one. It's going to have Nicholas Kiersey and Jason Lee Bias, but then the one that's the week after, so premiering a week from tomorrow. Yeah. So the last episode of 2020, because we're going to take a short break around Christmas and New Year's, is going to be the Zizek and Amber Frost one. So that should be fun. But yeah, these are both, and anybody who's seen either of these guys, like they're both very like mic drop prone in their rhetorical styles, which are understandably very very similar. Since they grew up in the same house, and they even come, as we were talking about last week, they come from the same political background. That obviously they grew up in somewhat conservative household, but they both went through phases of being like college Trotskyists, and then Hitchens stayed on the left in most ways for most of his life. He obviously had what, from my perspective, are some pretty horrific, positions on foreign policy in the last decade of his life. But he saw that as something he could make a left case for. And Peter Hitchens, his brother, who, by the way, should be on the show at some point. I'm not sure when, but he said he'd do it. Went way to the right. So there's a line we quoted last week from Christopher Hitchens' memoir, Hitch 22, where Christopher says that Peter's book, The Broken Compass, contains assertions so reactionary he felt the need to wear a garlic necklace to read it. So that gives you some sense. And they're both Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens in this era of his life, was very focused on atheism and really anti-theism. The idea that there's kind of a moral or political imperative to combat the influence of religion, and Peter went in the opposite direction, right? Like Peter Hitchens has a book called The Rage Against God, which is I guess anti-theist. So you get an idea. So let's start it up. Let's watch the beginning.
Concerns God. The proposition is God does not exist and he is not great. A historical note, exactly 80 years ago, back in 1928, Clarence Darrow debated a similar proposition within these walls. Well, since Peter went first on the previous question, Christopher will go first on this one. Christopher, 10 minutes.
You mean you're ready for another burst from? Okay, there's something wrong with this coin toss business. Okay, let me see. I don't think it's going to take 10 minutes to disprove the existence of God. The atheist proposition is the following. Most of the time, it may not be said that there is no God. It may be said that there is no reason to think that there is one. That was the situation after Lucretius and Democritus and the original anti-theistic thinkers began their critique of religion. And I would just ask you all, ladies and gentlemen, to bear in mind a mild distinction while we go on. You may wish to be a deist, as my heroes Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were, and you may not wish to abandon the idea that there must be some sort of first or proximate cause or prime mover of the known and observable world and universe. But even if you can get yourself to that position, which we unbelievers maintain is always subject to better and more perfect and more elegant explanations. Even if you can get yourself left in, all your work is still ahead of you. To go from being a deist to a theist, in other words, from someone who says, God cares about you, knows who you are, minds what you do, answers your prayers, cares which bits of your penis or clitoris you saw away or have sawn away for you, minds who you go to bed with and in what way, minds what holy days you observe, minds what you eat, minds what positions you use for pleasure. All your work is still ahead of you, and lots of luck. Because there's nobody, even Aquinas had to give it up. There's no one who can move from the first position to the second. So I could, and I'm actually strongly tempted to, I could leave it right there. But then it's not in my nature to let off a captive audience so easily. So I'll add a couple of things. The reasons why I am glad that this is not true would, I suppose, be the gravamen of my case. Some people I know who are atheists will say they wish they could believe it. Some people I know who are former believers say they wish they could have their old faith back. They miss it. I don't understand this at all. I think it's an excellent thing that there's no reason to believe in the absurd propositions I just, admittedly rather briefly, rehearsed to you. The main reason for this, I think, is that it is a totalitarian belief. It is the wish to be a slave. It is the desire that there be an unalterable, unchallengeable, tyrannical authority who can convict you of thought crime while you are asleep, who can subject you, who must indeed subject you to a total surveillance around the clock, every waking and sleeping minute of your life, I say of your life, before you're born, and even worse, and where the real fun begins, after you're dead. A celestial North Korea. Who wants this to be true? Who but a slave desires such a ghastly fate? I've been to North Korea. It has a dead man as its president. Kim Jong-il is only head of the party and head of the army. He's not head of the government or the state. That office belongs to his deceased father, Kim Il-sung. It's a necrocracy. A thanatocracy. It's one short of a trinity, I might add. The son is the reincarnation of the father. It is the most revolting and utter and absolute and heartless tyranny the human species has ever evolved. But at least you can fucking die and leave North Korea.
That's a good line.
Does the Quran or the Bible offer you that liberty? No. No. The tyranny, the misery, the utter ownership of your entire personality, the smashing of your individuality only begins at the point of death. This is evil. This is a wicked preachment. So that's the first thing. Second, it attacks us in our deepest, most essential integrity. It's an insult to us in other ways. It says that we, you and I, could not, individually or collectively, decide upon a right action or a right thing without celestial divine permission. We would not know right from wrong if we did not have heaven's permission to do so. Where else, how else could we know? Our human solidarity, our innate knowledge of right and wrong, our acute awareness of what is fair and what is unfair, what is just and worthless to us, these come to us also as gifts from the great unassailable dictator enthroned. What could abolish our integrity? What could abolish our honesty, our decency, our dignity more than that? The third is a little more pragmatic. Religion is our first, that's why I'm so fascinated with it, it's our first version of the truth. It's our first attempt as a species. It's what we tried when we didn't know anything. We didn't know we lived on a spherical planet. We didn't know that our planet revolved around the sun. We didn't know that there were microorganisms that explained disease. We thought diseases came from curses or witches or ill-wishing or devils or dust devils. We know anything from the childish, terrified, ignorant origins of our animal primate species. We come to origin. It's also our first attempt at philosophy, our first attempt at morality, our first attempt at healthcare, actually. But because it was our first, it is our worst. We now have better explanations for all these dreads, and we have cleared up all of these mysteries, yet we still dwell. And in some countries and some societies, not just dwell, but live under a totalitarian regime that forbids us to think about the progress that has been made, or denies us the knowledge that these advances have in fact occurred. So it has become, where once it probably was an aid to our survival, a really great peril to our continued ability to live as a civilized species. Thus, it seems to me that in point of its proposing of a totalitarian solution to what is after all a real problem, to its ghastly reliance upon the supernatural rather than the much more miraculous, much more beautiful, much more elegant, much more numinous, much more harmonious natural explanations. Think how much lovelier Einstein and Darwin are. Think how much more elegant and persuasive they are than the idea of the burning bush, or the demand that without circumcision there can be no redemption. Just picture it, and then I'll give you one final thought experiment. This is what you have to believe now, if you're a monotheist. Because we now know things we didn't used to know. We know that the human species could be as much as 200,000 years ago. It becomes separate from the Cro-Magnons and the rival prehuman species. Could be as little as 100. Richard Dawkins thinks 200,000. Francis Collins, who did the Human Genome Project, who's, by the way, C.S. Lewis kind of Christian, thinks 100,000. All right, I'll take 100. I'll take 100. Here's what you have to believe. For 100,000 years, humans are born as a primate species. Expectation of life, what, 25 years for the first few 100,000 years? First few tens of thousands of years. Infant mortality, rife. Microorganism disease, terrifying. Earthquakes, volcanoes, extraordinary. And fights over land, over territory, over food, over women, over tribalism. Frightening too. For 96,000 years, heaven watches this. With folded arms, with indifference, with coldness. And then around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, but only in really barbaric, illiterate parts of the Middle East. Not in China or where people can read or think or do science. No. In barbaric, illiterate, backward parts of the Middle East, it's decided we can't let this go on, we better intervene. And what better way than by human sacrifices and plagues and mass murder? And if that doesn't make them behave morally, we just don't know what does. If there is a single person in this room who can bring themselves to believe anything remotely like that, they convict themselves of being, first, very stupid, and second, very immoral. And thus, it seems to me that the case for divine intervention and for the supernatural falls, and that we should be glad that it's fallen. And thank you.
Well, he definitely doesn't still man the position, does he?
He does not.
No, furthest thing from, right?
Yeah, it was interesting. It's interesting that the proposition they're debating is that God does not exist and is not great. That doesn't quite make sense, but let's move past that. But really, most of his argument there is not an atheistic argument. It's an anti-theistic argument, right? He only really makes atheistic points there kind of at the end, right?
Yeah. That's right. I mean, I think this is actually a general thing about Hitchens, new atheism period. that the atheism often seems like an afterthought, or like it doesn't really actually seem central to what he's really interested in doing there, which you can see in that clip, because like the first thing he says is it's not going to take me 10 minutes to disprove the existence of God, which of course is a very funny line. But then there's no point in the 10 minutes where he seems to actually try to do that.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. In fact, he speaks against the ability to disprove it ultimately or not. Right. Is like
in a way
a secondary thing.
Yeah, in a way that really bothers me. That's a line that I hear in other people try to argue for, and I never found that convincing. That what he says, that it may not be possible to disprove the existence of God, but it can be said that there is no reason to believe in God. But if that's the case, that seems that you've done what you need to do to disprove the existence of God, right?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I actually thought you were going somewhere different from that. Like it seems like, right. So if there's no reason to believe in the existence of God, there could also just be no reason to believe in the non-existence of God. Like it could be that the correct position is just agnosticism.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have to couple that with the unspoken premise that if God did exist, there probably would be some good reasons to believe in him. It's like, I have no reason to believe that there's a werewolf in my closet, but actually the fact that I have no reason to believe it gives me a pretty good reason to believe that there is not a werewolf in my closet, because if there was one, I'd hear scratching noises.
Right.
I should expect something to happen. And so, this is Russell's teapot. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, yeah, Russell's teapot, right. Yeah, you want to wrap that up?
Yeah, this has always been anytime I talk to someone who has a settled position of agnosticism, I always try to nudge them that last step into good old-fashioned atheism with Russell's teapot, which is, the argument that, for those of you who don't know, Russell's teapot is, the proposition is that there is a teapot floating out in space somewhere between the orbits of Earth and Mars, and the point here is that we have no reason to believe that teapot exists. And given that we have no reason to believe the teapot exists, actually the rational thing to do is to actively disbelieve that it exists, right? And I think that a stronger case for atheism can be made than the kind of agnosticism that he opens up with.
Yeah, so I guess actually like the Russell teapot thing is a slightly different argument. I mean, it gets to the same place. It seems like the implied argument with Russell's teapot is that if there's no reason to believe that God exists, then for the sake of simplicity, like Occam's razor, we should believe that God doesn't exist. Whereas I think, that might be a good enough argument, but I think your werewolf analogy,
it's better, yeah.
A step further, that it's not just like, okay, all else is equal, and all else being equal, you should, postulate the existence of fewer things. It's that, no, really, if, if God existed, we would think, that we would have evidence of it. So that argument, so like to put it pithily, that, some people like to say the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but like, no, really, in lots of contexts, given reasonable background assumptions, it is absence of evidence.
Right.
So I should say, by the way, before we go any further here, so 255 AD asked a totally reasonable question, which is about the ambivalence that I've expressed in the past about the topic, and so I think it's worth clarifying with respect to what I'm ambivalent, right? So, which is not the actual, position. I mean, if any, I think I've always been pretty upfront that I'm on Team Christopher here, but is how to think about the topic and how to present the topic, because my big problem with like new atheism has always been the sort of not the atheism, which I agree with, but the sort of politicized anti-theism. which is a slightly different thing, and it's one that's like really crystallized. Like, let's see, let me find trying to remember the name of the okay, so Tim Minchin has this like secularist Christmas song called "White Wine in the Sun," and somebody mentioned it, and I was listening to it the other day. It's a really nice song. I like it. It's like it's kind of funny and kind of and kind of moving. But there's this lyric at the beginning that really crystallizes like the problem I always had with New Atheism, which is when he says, "To tell you the truth, I would rather have break bread with Richard Dawkins than Desmond Tutu." And I was listening to that, I was like, "What the hell's wrong with you?" Dude, Tutu, right? I mean, it's like
yeah.
That's clearly a more interesting. This could be a more interesting conversation, and also an unfathomably superior human being to Richard Dawkins. So, like, and that's the thing, that sure, I'm an atheist, but like, tons of atheists are like, libertarians, or have some other, like have some other general worldview that like I really dislike. Whereas, like even apart from being married to one, like I have a long-standing soft spot for religious leftists.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about that, Ben. Actually, you said that this has always been your problem with New Atheism, and a little background: Ben and I are friends from way back in grad school. We had many booze-addled conversation about religion, and at our grad school there were some people who, almost everyone's an atheist, right? In philosophy, almost everyone, 80% of professional, academic, at least analytic philosophers are
atheists, right? I mean, it might be more than 20% because there are, like, if nothing else, like there are a lot of Christian colleges that have philosophy departments, but who knows, right? It's certainly a majority position.
It's kind of I got the feeling that it's sort of gauche to press too much on the importance of atheism, and I think that a lot of the atheists that we knew never even identified themselves as atheists because it just didn't seem that important. It wasn't an interesting philosophical topic, but there were a group of grad students who really cared about atheism.
Yeah.
And I think that pretty consistently those were grad students who were brought up religious. Just Ryan, Micah, me, Brian, some names nobody else knows, but these are people who were brought up religious and they became kind of stridently atheistic. I always kind of counted you in that group, not of being brought up as religious, but being kind of strident about your atheism.
No, I'm just a dick when I argue about things.
Okay, that might be that might be what I was picking up on.
Yeah, so I think that's pretty common though online. I mean, it's a lot of folks who are more outspoken against religion have some kind of personal upbringing or some kind of biographical context for why they are so animated against religion or against theism, particularly. And even within in the context of this debate, we're seeing very much a kind of historically Western traditions arguing amongst themselves, like, okay, we were atheists or we are theists and we were arguing against our previous theism. And wasn't it so weird to believe in a North Korea in the sky or something along those lines? So it's a kind of a discourse with itself, you know what I mean? Just in terms of Western imagination, Western religion. And that's how I've always seen this. And I get a lot of fun out of having conversations and going into debates, atheism versus theism, panpsychism, speaker. I love having those conversations, but I think a lot of this is for the most part, Anglo-speaking worlds battling with its own kind of history and religious history, really.
Yeah. I think Hitchens actually in his atheism book, he does have one chapter for you. That's like called like No Eastern Solution or something, although I might yeah. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting, that connection that Christopher Hitchens is not somebody who grew up particularly religious. That, like, they're, Christopher and Peter's parents, like raised them in the Church of England, but I think like that's, not a very intense thing, certainly wasn't a very intense thing for them. In fact, he famously discovered as an adult that his mom was born Jewish, which she never shared with them. And it wasn't like, she went through some sort of religious epiphany to, convert to the Church of England. Like that was just kind of like I want to set my kids on a certain path in life to, private schools and the, inside track to the British ruling class. And I don't get the sense that the Admiral Hitchens, their father, was super religious either. So this is actually, I guess in some ways Peter is more stereotypical there in terms of, being like intensely religious after not having been brought up intensely religious. And Christopher is maybe a little bit more unusual in being intensely anti-religious without having been brought up in a super religious way. Like again, they were baptized. I'm sure they had to like go to church, as kids, but it doesn't. At least nothing I've read by him gives me the impression that it was like a huge part of their family life.
His fervor for this topic, like Richard Dawkins was the result of 9/11, right?
Yeah,
That's a good question. I think so. I mean, a lot of this pushback was, maybe religion is a big problem for modernity and globalization. What are we going to do with the religious imagination and in the West and then outside of the West? So I think, even this debate being connected to the first half about, foreign policy is actually very much on point. They are related with each other.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Like to be fair, if you read Hitchens' book, Letters to a Young Contrarian, which came out in 2001. In fact, I think it came out like, if I'm remembering this right, I think it might have like the release date might have been like September 12th, 2001 or something. But it was, but anyway, it was clearly written pre 9/11. And in there is like a little section on religion. It doesn't take up much of the book. I will say that it's like one of many things that makes Letters to a Young Contrarian interesting is like a transitional fossil and Hitchens' ideological evolution, along with the fact that it's the book where he officially gives up on thinking that socialism is ever going to happen, is that in that little religion chapter, he pretty much says everything that he would go on to say in God Is Not Great and elsewhere. Like the whole critique of religion is already there, pretty fully formed. But I will say, like, he seems a lot less intense about it at that point. Mm-hmm. Like I don't think he had quite the emotional fervor that he'd have about it later. And I think Jeremy's right that a lot of that was 9/11 and drawing some kind of point at, like, thinking that the takeaway that you should have to from 9/11 is that fundamentalist religiosity and by extension religiosity in general is this huge threat to the world. And also, frankly, I think maybe the fact, so like, all right, so on one level, it's like part of the package with the bad foreign policy views. Although on another level, maybe this is totally unfair, but I've always suspected, or I've long suspected that maybe part of it was like compensation that he didn't want to spend all of his time arguing with, liberals and progressives and leftists. He wanted to still feel like he was somebody who, would piss off the right, and this, and this gave him a way to do it. Like if anybody's ever seen, there's a classic appearance by Hitchens on Sean Hannity after Jerry Falwell died, and he goes balls out for that. I mean, he says at one point in that discussion that Falwell was so full of shit that if they'd given him an enema, they could have buried him in a matchbox.